Good evening, everybody. My name is Karen, and I study the psychology of conspiracy theories, and I've been studying this topic for about 15 years or so now. So I study why people believe in these sorts of ideas, and also what some of the consequences of believing in conspiracy theories actually are. So I'm very excited to chat with Marianna tonight, and well, because it's very nice to chat with you, finally actually meet you in person, but also because in the research that I do, I tend to run very large surveys and experiments with large groups of people, and I don't actually often talk to people who believe in conspiracy theories. And I know that Marianna definitely has done this, so I'm really keen to hear more about your experiences and specifically what you've learned and the interactions that you've had with people during the process of putting your book together. So I'll stop talking and I'm going to ask you a question now. My first question, if it's okay, I could open with a question just really about why you decided to write this particular book.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Sorry I'm really, really soggy because I just came from the train station, probably like you all did, in the rain. Thank you all for coming along. And to Karen, of course, for chairing it, and for Kev for that intro as well. Why did I write the book? I think that the book in many ways captures a lot of the podcasts, investigations, other reporting I've done at the BBC into social media's real world consequences, as I often call it. So disinformation, but also hate, algorithms, how all of this stuff works. And I think that by tracking down the real people who are caught up in this stuff, whether it's the people sharing it, the people who are harmed and affected by it, and then also the people who've worked inside the social media companies, other people who are affected or connected to this world that I often call Conspiracyland, and I do in the book. I think that really helps us to better understand the impact that this is having on all of us. And actually, people often ask me whether I'm sort of a tech journalist or what kind of am I? And actually, a lot of what I do is about sort of, in a similar way to what you look at, but in a different sort of journalistic sense, sociology and anthropology and like how we all work and behave and the impact of what's going on online. And I've been having quite a few conversations recently, I think, particularly after the riots that happened in the summer, and serious questions about the role that social media played in that. And I don't think it's the same at all in many ways to other scandals we've seen, like the post office scandal, contaminated blood scandal, and so on. But I do think we will probably look back in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, even now, to be honest, and think people like me have been banging on about the impact that this stuff has and the harm that it can cause. And you email the social media companies and nothing really happens. Yeah. So I think it's really important to bring it to life for people so they can actually understand who believes this stuff and who gets drawn into it and why it matters to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it'd be really nice to talk a little bit more about social media. I've got another question about that a little bit later on, but I guess to kind of to strip it back to, I guess, a more traditional medium. You, at the beginning of the book, met some people who were reading a newspaper called The Light. And I found that really fascinating. I have seen it, I have read it, I've seen copies distributed. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that is, what's in it, and how you think it's influencing people.
Yeah, so The Light, for anyone who hasn't encountered it before, is a conspiracy theory newspaper. It has some things that are kind of true and quite mundane, but a lot of its content is misleading, false, some is hateful or has promoted hate. They would strongly reject those allegations, as I found out when I sat opposite its editor. And this paper was something that's sprung up during the pandemic. And in many ways, like a lot of the book follows the way that the conspiracy theory movement has evolved during and since, or rather since sort of lockdowns finished, the pandemic. And the paper itself was being distributed kind of within local communities, and I kept getting messages about it. People kept saying, Marianna, what is this? Why has this been put through my front door? It was saying stuff that was not true about about the pandemic specifically, but other issues too, the environment, climate change, terror attacks, 9/11. And so I decided to spend a bit of time in one particular community in Totnes in the southwest of the UK, where this paper really had sort of made waves and impacted quite a lot of people who'd been reaching out to me. And Totnes is sort of a place that's known for alternative thinking. There's a really sort of vibrant community there. People love sharing their views, different views, but people felt as though the paper was starting to become a problem and causing quite serious division. There were people who were part of the local council there, other members of the community who didn't like what was forming. And I spent a bit of time with some of the people who were drawn into the paper. There's one particular interaction that stays with me, and it was with this woman called Natalie, which I talk about in the first chapter of the book, The True Believers. And Natalie is, she was at this rally and she had this cap on that said, "Wake up, Devon," which when you become well-versed in conspiracyland, you know all those kinds of words like wake up and sheeple and crisis actors and all this stuff. I hope that you actually, it would be better if you weren't fluent in that language if you're here. She was there with her cap and she was laying out this massive poster, and it had these like bright red eyes. And it was about kind of all of us being watched and the sort of end of society. And I wandered up to her and I sort of said, "Oh, hi, what are you up to?" And she was like, "Oh, I'm just putting out my poster." I was like, "Okay, great. Can I ask a little bit about why you're here?" And it was this rally that there weren't lockdowns anymore. So it wasn't an anti-lockdown rally. It wasn't a mixture of people who were concerned about the proportionality of lockdown measures and then also, false claims that the pandemic was designed to murder and kill millions of people and the vaccine was the same and all that kinds of stuff. It was kind of beyond that. It was sort of this so-called freedom movement that they wanted to be there to express their opinions. And by and large, it was a pretty sort of peaceful affair. People were just sort of milling about, chatting to each other. So we start talking and she tells me about how, we're all being murdered and killed by everything from the vaccine to 15-minute cities. So people, which I couldn't quite work out the line where I would got there, but that's kind of my life. And as we were talking, I brought up the light and I said, "Oh, this paper, what do you think about it?" And she said, "Oh, I really like it and here's why I like it." And I said, "What do you think about things that are false or also, people who are connected to prescribed far-right groups who've been praised or featured in the paper?" And she said, "Well, no, that's not the case. I don't believe things like that, but I think that it's okay to include them in the paper and so on." And we got into a bit of a back and forth. And then just kind of out of nowhere, she burst into tears. And I'd not really had anyone do that. Not at a rally like that in that way. And she said, "Oh, I've lost so many people. People don't want to talk to me, my friends and family. I can't communicate with them in the same way." And this is something I find so often, is that people like Natalie really believed what she was saying, was really nice, pleasant to talk to, genuinely thinks that these plots and plans are happening. And if you did, you'd be absolutely terrified. And that's not to say that bad things don't happen and powerful people don't do bad things, which is incredibly well documented and probably under-documented. But it's more so that people like her do believe these really, really sinister plots that are beyond the evidence available to us. And then it takes them away from their family and friends. It takes them away from reality and they become part of this new community and it kind of changes their lives. And, she then stopped crying and she marched off and she had this big megaphone and she was saying, "The cashless society is going to get us all." And that was sort of that. But I was just really struck by how, for me, she epitomizes what I call in the book the true believer, someone who genuinely is convinced by this stuff, has fallen deeper down that rabbit hole, both on social media and then because of these other things like the light, and finds herself in this alternative sort of world, Conspiracyland.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I've seen a couple of these demonstrations just walking around in Canterbury where I live. And there was the idea of the 15-minute cities, vaccines, lockdowns. They were talking about everything. Everything sort of seemed to fit this kind of worldview, which is actually kind of something that brings me to the next question, sort of turning to more of a question of who are these true believers? What kind of personality characteristics, what kinds of psychological factors there are. And as you know, I do a lot of work on this kind of topic. And
I was going to say, I definitely quote you on this in the book. So it's quite funny me telling you.
I noticed that. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that in the book you did identify in your conversations and your interactions with people quite a lot of these factors that do crop up a lot in the psychological research on conspiracy beliefs. So things like disillusionment, loneliness, feeling isolated from other people, worried, having struggling with cost of living, all those sorts of things. Living during a pandemic obviously was a big one. And all of these sorts of reasons why people are looking for alternative explanations, ways to try to feel better about bad things that are happening to them. And I just wondered if, in your travels through Conspiracyland, if you thought there might be, I guess, what is the most prominent of these sorts of factors that you think
Draws people.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. I mean, the starting point, and it's something that you've written about as well, is that we have quite a lot of misconceptions about the people who believe this stuff. People often think that you have to be stupid, or a bit mad, or you're sitting at home in a basement. That's just not the kinds of people I've encountered. That's not true. And there are all kinds of factors. Disillusionment, like you mentioned. People who are deeply cynical, I find, more so than gullible. People who are very engaged online, like spend a lot of time on social media. They're often feeling isolated in other ways in their personal lives. They're looking for fulfillment and purpose. And quite a lot of the time, they are trying to make sense of stuff that's really horrible. I think the thing I find unites most of these people, and I think it's important to separate out what I call the true believers and what I call the non-believers with a question mark, who are the people who benefit from sharing this stuff in some way, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But when it comes to the true believers, they are people who often, I think, are trying to make sense of the world and the kind of chaos that it just exists. They want to be able to rationalize it, but they do so in a way that is incredibly irrational, which I think always strikes me as, gosh, it would be so stressful to believe the things they believe, but actually it's sort of the opposite for them. There was a woman who I spent some time with in Wales who was called Alicia. She was really lovely. Again, welcome me into her house. And I found her because she'd been commenting on the Facebook posts of a man called Richard D. Hall. Richard D. Hall is someone who I investigated because he was tracking down and secretly recording survivors of the Manchester Arena bombing and checking whether their injuries were real. So pretty shocking content and tactics in order to deliver that content. And Alicia had been commenting on his posts. He was running a market stall at that time, and he was selling his book and various other DVDs. His book includes these false claims about the Manchester Arena survivors. In the back, for example, there were lists of where he believed children who'd been killed were actually living, things like that. It's reminiscent of the Sandy Hook conspiracy theories that Alex Jones promoted in the United States about this school shooting. And Alicia was commenting saying, can't wait to come to the market stall. And I was thinking, I wonder who they, I can't understand, but I can understand why someone like Richard D. Hall shares what he does. And we can talk about that. But to understand why someone who, by all other accounts, looks like someone you'd quite happily bump into and have a conversation with, would be willing to kind of go to a market stall and buy something like that. And so I messaged her and she said, I'm happy to chat to you, come round. And she ends up with BBC Panorama sort of barged into her living room, which is probably not a good way to start your Wednesday or whatever it was. She said, I see his stuff because I just don't know who to trust anymore. I don't know who to trust or what to trust. And for her, COVID had definitely affected it massively, the pandemic. Her mum had died. She was really isolated and quite lonely. She wasn't able to work. She was really struggling financially. This was when the cost of living crisis was really bad as well. Again, none of these are the reasons she believes conspiracy theories, but they all affected the circumstances in which she was existing, and meant that she was turning to other places. She didn't trust the media anymore. She really didn't trust the media, and that is something, I think that kind of distrust and cynicism is perhaps the thing that is the most kind of common attribute that people share. And when we started talking about the Manchester Arena attacks and the conspiracy theories that Richard D. Hall had shared, and we're talking through them, and I said, do you really think these things are true? And she said, this is the suggestion that crisis actors were used to fake this event, that really brave survivors have faked their injuries in some way. And she said, no, well, I kind of want it to be true because I'd rather them I think it was terrible and I'd rather it not have happened. And for her, I think there was that element of, well, if I can explain it in this way, then maybe I can believe that these kinds of horrible things don't happen. And I can believe that these kids are somewhere else. And like I've spoken to the parents of people, children who were killed, who say like they would give absolutely anything in the world for that to be true, but it isn't. And she ended the conversation by, and I sort of said to her, well, I've spoken to survivors and I've spoken to parents of children who were killed. And this is really distressing for them. Do you understand that? And it almost felt like this kind of weird penny drop moment where she was like, oh, yeah. Oh, and it seems silly now, I think, when you're sitting here, you think, oh, how could someone not have thought of that? How could they not? But it's almost like that's sort of besides the point. It is like kind of inhabiting almost like a Marvel universe where like it's really detached from reality. And after that point, she was really apologetic, really regretted it. And actually kind of had the guts, which I respect massively, to turn around and say, actually, I don't think that's right, and I'm really sorry, and I shouldn't have indulged that. And I think that takes quite a lot of courage. So I find that she, in many ways, I think is symbolic of most of the people I encounter who believe this stuff. They don't necessarily mean to cause the harm that they do. They use it to rationalize the world in a way that can cause harm. And they're often quite frightened and very distrustful.
Yeah, and looking for a way to feel better about a bad situation and looking for an explanation that's going to give them some kind of satisfaction, even though it might not be a nice explanation. You feel better because at least you know
exactly
you feel that you know what the truth is, even if you don't. Yeah, that's super interesting. So another question I was going to ask, and again, sort of like moving back to a very, very common finding in the psychology of conspiracy theories, is that if people do believe in one conspiracy theory, so, for example, about 9/11 or pandemic-related conspiracy theories, then they are more likely to believe in others. That doesn't say that if you believe one, you'll definitely believe in another, but you are more likely to do so, which kind of leads some scholars to argue that there's something akin to a conspiracy mindset. Well, I don't know if I really buy that, but that's what some people would argue. But I think that one thing that people are thinking a little bit more about now is that some conspiracy theories really catch on, and they can become gateway conspiracy theories to others. And I think that happened a lot during the pandemic, where people weren't really interested in conspiracy theories. They weren't thinking about this sort of thing. And then this happened and the world kind of all went to shit, and then these explanations, just started to become more interesting. And have you come across any other examples of these sort of gateway conspiracy theories that might lead people to kind of go down rabbit holes when they might not ordinarily do so?
Yeah, I think you're right about the pandemic, and the pandemic was, by all accounts, absolutely rubbish. So you can really understand why people went looking for answers and became exposed to stuff they wouldn't have otherwise, and were recommended it on their feeds and so forth. Interestingly, and this is not in the book, but it is sort of hot off the press. I've done a podcast. I'm doing a new podcast series, Why Do You Hate Me USA? And the first episodes were out this week. And the very first episode is about two women, one who wants Donald Trump to win the US election, and one who absolutely hates Donald Trump and has voted Democrat for the past 15 years. And the first is called Wild Mother. She is perhaps what you would consider someone who is very well acquainted with the conspiracy theory playbook. For her, I think the pandemic turbocharged her belief that almost anything and everything can be staged, but she then uses it to retrospectively explain 9/11, everything else that's happened. So it perhaps comes as little surprise that she thought the assassination attempt that happened on Donald Trump back in July was staged in some way. What was interesting with her was that she didn't believe the kind of straightforward thing. So you might think that if you're someone who believes in QAnon, which is this sprawling conspiracy theory that suggests that Donald Trump is waging a secret war against people in the deep state, this cabal of elites and media and pedophiles and all this kinds of stuff, you'd think that when that shooting happens, you'd go, aha, the thing we've been saying the whole time is going to happen, his enemies want to get him, has happened. But I think it gives you such an insight into how this world works and how Conspiracyland operates that Wild Mother didn't think that. Instead, she thought layer above, which is Donald Trump's own team staged the shooting in order to frame the deep state so that people would know that his enemies were out to get him, because she couldn't possibly believe the simpler version of events. And there's no evidence to support that theory. But she's someone who perhaps I, again, would have anticipated. She was lovely to talk to, really interesting, and exhibited a lot of the attributes of Alicia and the other people we've chatted about. Camille, on the other hand, who had voted Democrat for the past 15 years, she's never believed anything was staged, ever. She, or at least in this kind of context, she thought the pandemic was real. She was outraged at false suggestions that the election had been rigged in 2020. And she is very willing to get stuck in and argue with Trump supporters all the time on X, what was Twitter. And for the first time in her life, she found herself saying, this shooting is staged. And a lot of it began with legitimate questions about security failings. How on earth did this happen? Why did it happen? And so on. And there remain loads of questions about the motive, which we don't know, and what's gone on. There are loads of questions that people have. But she found herself on X being actively recommended at the very top of her feed from accounts she trusts because she agrees with them. People saying it was staged, and here's why it's staged, and it was becoming kind of increasingly extreme in its theorizing. And for her, that really felt like a gateway, and I think that moment has felt like a bit of a gateway in the States, at least. Certainly for people who are perhaps closer to the centre or leaning to the left of the political spectrum, who think, oh, actually, maybe I can also use this same language, this kind of conspiracyland, or however I want to call it, in order to describe stuff. So I think that's actually the most recent one that I can think of. There are other events, like I feel like every time a terror attack happens, that can be pretty much a gateway. There's someone in the book I talk about, Brent Lee, who's a reform conspiracy theorist, who I spent a lot of time talking to, and who actually apologized to a 7/7 survivor because he had promoted conspiracy theories about that bombing. That for him was, 9/11 was perhaps the main gateway, but that was sort of the secondary route into this world. And then also wars and, the war in Gaza, the Hamas attacks on Israel, some of the same tropes from Conspiracyland, from the playbook, have been applied to those situations. And not just by people in Conspiracyland, by very powerful people, by politicians and so on. But the suggestion that people are dolls or fake, that they're not real, the suggestion that everything is staged or a hoax, or people are acting, all of that stuff is applied to other situations. But I'd say, it's tended to be like 9/11, the pandemic, and actually the assassination attempt, for me, are like three key moments that seem to have recruited people. 9/11 is obviously a little bit different because it wasn't the social media age, it was the DVD sort of floppy disk phase.
And yet we still had lots and lots of conspiracy theories without social media. However, I did want to talk about social media because a question that I get asked a lot, and I'm sure it's exactly the same for you: what has social media done? How has it made this worse? Are people believing in more conspiracy theories? Is it worse now that we have social media? And I know you said you weren't a tech journalist, but if you could maybe talk a little bit as well about the algorithm.
Oh, I love the algorithm, don't worry. I'm just not a tech journalist in the boring sense.
Okay, well,
Joking. I love talking about social media and investigating all things social media. Yes, I'm very happy to talk about the algorithms. I think actually it's an important point to make, that kind of journey from perhaps 9/11 to now. I talk about it in the book, but 9/11 is I feel bad now. I feel like some tech journalist is going to watch this and be like, man, I was so rude about us. Anyway, oh well. On 9/11, I was in year one. I was 5 years old, and my mum came to collect me from primary school. And I remember it so well because it's perhaps like the first major news event I remember. And I just couldn't understand it. I couldn't make sense of it. My mum said, some people have thrown some planes into a building. And I sort of said, was it was an accident? And my mum said, oh no, it wasn't an accident. And I just didn't get that, which probably reflects quite well on my childhood up until that point. But also, I think helps me sometimes to think about how people who believe conspiracy theories think, because it's so hard to believe this stuff. So I think that way of thinking has always existed and will continue to exist, and has. The difference that social media makes is that way of thinking existed more privately. You weren't necessarily connected with loads and loads of other people who not only believed the same things as you, but then would further that belief. You weren't necessarily being actively recommended stuff. And I think a really good example of this is in the book I talk about a woman called Heather, who I was investigating. People might remember when a woman called Nicola Bulley went missing in St Michael's on Wyre last February. And it triggered an absolute frenzy on TikTok in particular of conspiracy theories, speculation, disinformation, much of which was targeting the family, those who lived close to where she went missing. She was later found in the river, and a coroner ruled that she died because of that. But that didn't stop the conspiracy theories either, and particularly the kind of TikTok sleuths who were turning up and posting this stuff. But what was interesting is, and maybe this is another kind of gateway moment, what was interesting is these were not people who had form at sharing this stuff. They weren't necessarily just the kind of true crime sleuths, the people who already got views and likes out of this. It was kind of newcomers, and Heather was one of those newcomers. So Heather lived in Cardiff with her family, it still does, and she posted videos falsely suggesting that Nicola Bulley's best friend, a woman called Emma, had pretended to be her on the morning she went missing. She analysed CCTV and posted it on her TikTok feed. She'd never posted a video like this before. It got 10 million views. And she immediately says, oh wow, okay, people want this stuff. She gets an email from TikTok saying, you're a hit, keep posting. And she's being actively pushed this stuff on her feed. That was why she shared it in the first place, because she identified with Nicola Bulley. She's a mum of 2 young kids. She really cared about the story, and her algorithm was going, right, you're interested in this stuff, you're going to get more of it. And so she found herself drawn into it, started posting, continued to post several videos that got huge amounts of views that were false, and absolutely regretted it, was so ashamed, couldn't believe that she'd sort of got to that point. And I remember when the investigation went out that I did, it was about TikTok frenzies, not just in this case, but kind of different cases of horrible things happening and the way that the algorithm drives this huge amount of engagement. And she was so nervous that people would think so badly of her about it, which is so interesting because she'd been getting like 30 million views on TikTok and it didn't worry her then. But suddenly she thought, oh, people who aren't in my bubble and my world are going to think, what is she doing? And actually people were really sympathetic. People kind of understood it. When the conspiracy theories spread about Kate Middleton, it unfolded in a really similar way on TikTok. Jay Slater as well, who went missing this year and also had died. This stuff might seem like a bit of a hobby for the people who get sucked into it. For the families at the heart of it, it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. You've had someone go missing or be killed or lose them in a really painful way and don't have answers. And people are always going to fill the vacuum. And the media play a part in this too. The media will often then chase the likes and the views that the social media sites are getting. And a lot of this fundamentally comes back to how the algorithms work. And that is across the board, actually. TikTok would say, we've changed our rules to not recommend unfounded claims. We have all sorts of policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But across all of the sites, algorithms work by pushing you stuff that you will engage with and react to. And therefore, engagement is prioritized over safety. And I now just think that almost every investigation I do and every podcast and every chapter of that book come back to the same thing, which is this is about the design of the sites. Because it's not that this stuff can exist. And to be honest, people will always say things that are false and hateful. They do in the real world and they will online. But the difference is when that false and hateful stuff is recommended to millions of people and seen by millions of people by systems that are designed by the social media companies. So they're not passive mirrors that are reflecting the world back to us. They are actively distorting it because they have these recommendation systems. They would dispute that. But the whole idea that they're a mirror is something that they often say, that they think, we're not responsible for problems that exist in society, which is true. But social media can just turbocharge the way this stuff works. I did a Panorama documentary a few weeks ago now, and it came back to a similar thing. It was all about kids using social media. Should kids be using their phones? The broad consensus, certainly from doing the Panorama, was, well, I don't think it's going to work to ban people's phones because they're just so much a part of how we all work, adults and kids. But what felt like the problem was kids, and there was an 18-year-old called Kai who I chatted to, who was being recommended content, misogyny, hate, violence, that he just did not want to see. And he kept saying to the algorithms, I don't want to see this, kept indicating to the platforms he said he was still seeing it. When I tracked down people who'd worked on the inside at some of the companies, they said to me, well, that is just so baked into its design. And he's being recommended this stuff because they know that at this time he was 16, other 16-year-old boys are interested in this kinds of stuff, and that interest generates money. And that is at the heart of this. And I kind of think now, I was joking with one of the people who I work with at the BBC who edits my online pieces when I'm writing them. And he said, we were talking through the structure of this piece I was doing, and he said, and what's the revelation going to be at the end? oh, let me guess. Is it that the algorithms are driving? I was like, yeah, it is, because it keeps coming back to that. And I think that when people are thinking about solutions, and in many ways it's, it's my job as an investigative reporter to expose the problems and other people's job to come up with the solutions. But when people think about it, the algorithms are at the heart of it, because you can't change that. Online communities will exist. And sometimes online communities are good. Like, people meet people they wouldn't have, and that's a great thing. But it's just people being actively pushed this stuff. The riots were, again, are just really good example of that. And it's not just about people being pushed stuff that they then decide to reshare or post themselves. It's also about the way that, and this was the case in the TikTok frenzies that I talk about, so Heather, for example, but it's also the case with the riots and so many things, Camille and the Trump assassination, is that it distorts, if we think about where we get our social cues from, and you'll know this as a psychologist, it's all about like what we think other people think is normal and okay. And particularly for kids and teenagers, I think that's even more important. If you're being told that, 10 million other people like this too, or 5 million other people are interested in this, or you're being actively recommended it, so you think, they want me to see this, so it's okay for me to look at, that can then distort your perception of what is okay and isn't okay. And it's then that I find the bad stuff happens, not from the majority of people, but from the minority who are emboldened by that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm 100% with you that the big tech companies need to take more responsibility, instead of, an example, I was at a conference last week, and there was a panel discussion on young people using social media and the dangers of that. Not just in believing conspiracy theories, but like getting into, misogynistic content and all sorts of violent content, that sort of thing. And the solutions that people were coming up with in the audience, when we're like, parents need to restrict the amount of time the children spend on their phones, schools need to confiscate their phones, those sorts of things. But everybody kind of just danced around the issue of the algorithm and the big tech companies and the responsibility.
Because it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah. What can we do? Like,
and that's, I think that there's an amazing family who I write about in the book called, there's a couple called Amanda and Stuart Stevens, and their son Ollie was murdered near their home in Reading when he was 13 years old. And social media played a big part in what happened. Violence and hate being recommended to some of the kids involved, but then also the way that the attack was planned and so on. They are some of the bravest, kindest people I've ever met. And to think that it almost sometimes feels like the narrative sort of shifts the blame onto parents in that way. It's kind of like, well, couldn't you have done something? There's absolutely nothing they could have done because they couldn't see any of it and they didn't know about any of it. And there was just genuinely nothing they could have done. And there's this incredibly moving moment. And actually that bit in the book I found really sad to write, because, like they're like, they're not listening to us. The companies won't listen to us. And Stuart talks about being there when his son died and thinking, these people who are miles and miles away in, in this case, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, they don't care. He certainly didn't feel that. They would say that they do care. But I think that is crucial here, which is that there is a feeling, I think, particularly among parents, but not just parents, among loads of people, that the social media companies are not easy to hold to account. They are very rich. They are as powerful, if not more powerful, than some governments. But yet the level of transparency and accountability that we expect from them is so much less. I mean, you think about, my job is to investigate social media. I've not had a single boss at a social media company agree to an interview for me for over 2 years. Elon Musk, who spends a lot of his time talking about how important freedom of expression is and how journalists don't hold power to account anymore. They just parrot what they're told to say. Not true, or certainly not true for the journalists I work with. He won't answer any questions. He won't do an interview. I've tried multiple times to do an interview with him. In fact, you just end up getting sort of mercilessly trolled when you tried to do that. And I think that's something that we should all be paying quite a lot of attention to, because if we can't be asking these difficult questions of these people, then sort of, where are we? And I think that is the crux of this, that people don't quite know how to handle this. And if it does come back to the fundamental design of the platforms, then it requires some pretty sort of decisive action from those companies, but the incentive has to be great enough for them to do that. And we'll see with the Online Safety Act. Again, it's sort of not my job to advocate for a solution, but it'll be interesting to see to what extent that does or doesn't change how the companies approach this stuff.
Yep, no, absolutely. Yeah, so maybe just a slight change of direction then now. You talk a lot in the book, and I know I've seen you talk about this online as well, about how conspiracy theories can really damage people's relationships. So there's like, a lot of fractures in these relationships that people have with conspiracy believers. So if their spouse believes in conspiracy theories really strongly, then there can be difficulties in these relationships. And I've been doing some research on this topic myself, and finding very consistently that people have lower relationship satisfaction with individuals who, in their close circles, who believe in conspiracy theories, and they even don't want to get into future relationships with conspiracy believers. So these ideas, people at least believe in some way that they're quite toxic to relationship. So yeah, I was just wondering, amongst the people that you'd spoken to on your journey, could you think of any examples that you'd like to share of this sort of relationship issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. Like if I if I spoke through, if I read out to you now my messages, I'd say I get 2 or 3 messages every single day from people who want to tell me about someone they know who has become kind of very embroiled within conspiracy theories to the point where it's changed their relationship with them.
I get a lot as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be a neighbor, a colleague.
It's horrible when you can't help.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And people really want to help, and they don't want that fracturing of that relationship either. And they find it really understandably difficult. In fact, both people find it difficult. So there are there's kind of a sliding scale, I guess. And perhaps the example that's most useful to talk about here is one of the most extreme examples, because I think it captures a lot of this in quite a striking way, but it's certainly not emblematic of most people who get in touch, who are mainly saying, my dad or my aunt has started to get really sucked into this stuff, and it's been really hard to have a conversation, and we either have to choose to not talk about it at all, or I've had a really bad argument with them, or it's all a bit of a nightmare. But back in, this would have been in 2020, I think it was in the sort of September of 2020, and I write about it in the book, there was someone called Sebastian Shemirani who reached out to me. And Sebastian Shemirani is the son of a woman called Kate Shemirani, and she is a very prominent British conspiracy theorist, conspiracy theory influencer. She was a nurse. She was subsequently struck off by the Nursing and Midwifery Council for promoting false suggestions that the pandemic was a hoax, the vaccines were part of a genocidal plot. She suggested that doctors and nurses should be hanged, like after the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, all that kinds of stuff. And he reached out to me because he just kind of couldn't take it anymore. He kept seeing clips of his mum popping up at rallies, and he wanted to talk about the impact it had. And what really struck me about the conversation I had with him was how, actually, first and foremost, was his worry about the impact that his mum was having on public health, on people's decision making around the pandemic, and that they could come to harm because they were following bad advice, and he really didn't want that to happen. But actually at the heart of this was an incredibly sad breakdown of a relationship between a son and, like, it has to be really bad when you're saying, oh my gosh, I can't cope with my mum on BBC. Like you've reached like the, you to say like I need to talk to a journalist about this, I can't. It's got to a really difficult position. And he had, by this point, had very fraught communications with her, he said. This wasn't something that started with the pandemic. He grew up in a household where he said conspiracy theories were frequently talked about. He was constantly kind of told that these plots were going to happen and these attacks were going to happen, and they never happened. But he said you kind of live in this way where you feel kind of a bit terrified. And he's got siblings as well. And he, as time went on and the pandemic happened, his mum was able to grow her platform on social media. She was able to amass thousands and thousands of followers and views for her content. And he remembers messaging his brother in the pandemic and them both kind of saying, oh no, what are we going to do about this? And she was being, amplified on the platform. She was getting more reach. And saying some really outrageous things as well, which people were very shocked by. And for him, he just felt like he was like, I think I've decided I don't think I can have a relationship with my mum anymore. And I was really struck by the fact that he had not fallen down the rabbit hole, because I kind of thought, well, if you've grown up in that environment and this has been the way of looking at the world, you'd think, people often look at the world in a similar way to their parents, or, take on some of those views that they might have. And it was almost like he'd had like an allergic reaction to the conspiracy theories. He was one of the most rational people I've ever spoken to. Like, he was so good at kind of sorting out between, well, this is a legitimate worry and this is a fact and this is just not true. I guess because that became his kind of coping mechanism in that environment. And it was really sad. And after the interview went out, there was, received quite a lot of attention and pickup. And I actually was doing a different investigation for Panorama, which I talk about in the book as well, that was all about anti-vax videos that were being shared. This lovely woman in her 80s had reached out to me to say, I've been sent this video on WhatsApp and I'm really frightened to get the vaccine. Please, can you help? And so her story was sort of central to it. And I wanted to track down the people in the video who were making some unfounded claims, some sort of claims with a grain of truth, but that weren't true, and some stuff that was categorically false. I wanted to track them down to understand why they'd done what they'd done. And lo and behold, Kate Shemarani is one of the people that pops up in the video. And I think, there's no way she's going to want to talk to me because her son did this interview with me. And I just don't think she'd want to. I'd already asked her for an interview and she'd said no. But kind of surprisingly, she goes, oh, no, come round. So I find myself in her kitchen dressing her chihuahuas in Christmas jumpers, which felt like a real, what am I doing moment. And they're quite nice Christmas jumpers for the chihuahuas. And she kind of welcomed me into her home. And I think she wanted to kind of stick up for herself and show, I'm not some horrible person that my son has made me out to be and all this kinds of stuff. But when I told her about Rosemary and this video, she said, great, I'd love her not to get the vaccine. I think that would be brilliant for her. And it was the reaction of itself. I remember talking to the producer I was with afterwards, and we both just kind of, not so sure about that. And this was way beyond, again, legitimate questions and concerns about the vaccine and whether to have it and all that kinds of stuff. This was like, this is a genocide. Your DNA is going to be altered and you're going to be killed the minute you have it, which is why this lady was so worried. And, she was trying so hard to tell me about how, oh no, I do still message my son. I do still want to have a relationship with my son. I felt like my mum is a family therapist and my dad is a doctor, and I felt like I'd sort of inadvertently become a family therapist, and I was a bit like, don't quite know how to deal with this. But actually, that whole interaction and everything about their dynamic and relationship, I think, is a very extreme version of what a lot of people experience, which is, someone falling deeper into conspiracy theories. Sebastian had some really good advice because he'd experienced this for so long. So he'd say, I try and talk to my mum about the why rather than the what. Like, why do you think that? And what are you actually worried about here? Because often it wasn't about the conspiracy theory, it was about something else, a genuine concern, and trying to untangle the two, questioning the sources that she was using and saying, well, hang on a second, why do we trust this person over this person? And just, he did try initially, he says, to actually have that conversation, but he found that really difficult, and they'd get into really bad arguments, and he said it would get, really quite heated, and that wasn't good. And I hear that from people a lot. And it's for that reason that some people decide to just sort of opt out of it and say, well, let's just not talk about it. The problem is, and I've encountered other people who, in really sad cases, there's one man called Gary I talk about in the book who died of COVID-19. He didn't think it was real. And one of his friends, I remember a really sad moment where we were sort of standing outside where he'd lived, and she was like, "Oh, I wish I'd tried to have a conversation or to keep talking about it or to do something, but I didn't feel like I could, and now he's not alive anymore, and that's really sad." And so, yeah, I think this is something that I think this idea people kind of think, oh, it couldn't possibly be me or it couldn't possibly affect me, is totally wrong. Like, so many people believe this stuff, and they are perfectly nice, reasonable people in lots of other ways, but they get drawn into this stuff. And I think if you can just keep trying to have those conversations that don't become super combative, and like people often say to me, or you must get so annoyed when you're talking to people, or do you not want to kind of turn around and be like, well, that's not true. But that's just so counterproductive. Whereas actually, if I can understand why they believe what they believe and how they got there and what's being pushed on their social media feed and who it is telling, that's so much more useful, because then I can actually investigate what's going on and interrogate it. And I always find, actually, this week, as I was on my way here, I was talking to the team I work with on the podcast, and the two women I mentioned earlier who were in that first podcast episode, they, you might think they think, oh, I absolutely hate that because they're saying I believe conspiracy theories and I think they're true and all of this stuff. They were both really happy with it, because if you are fair to people and you listen to them and you try to understand, I find on the whole that they are pleased. And so I think that principle is a principle that works in other situations too. And certainly from the people I've spoken to who have managed to help someone sort of get out of the rabbit hole, that just trying to understand and being a little bit patient has been a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. It's not, you're never going to get through to somebody and change their mind by ridiculing them or being hostile to them. It's just not going to work. It doesn't work with anything, and it definitely doesn't work with conspiracy.
And it's not worthy of ridicule, because actually often it's really understandable how people have got there. So it's like, well, actually, you know, do take it seriously, because the impacts are serious on everyone.
Exactly.
And actually the thing that someone believes is also serious, because there will be a valid reason often that they think that.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to understand why they believe what they believe and address those issues rather than what they're actually telling you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another thing, I know we probably have to wrap up fairly soon, but another thing that I wanted to ask you about, because we've talked a lot about people who believe in conspiracy theories, so the believers, whether or not they're true believers or, well, anyway, so we get to that now, about these people who might not be the true believers. They might be peddling conspiracy theories to make money. Have you come across these people, and would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. And yes. I have. I think it's interesting, actually. Kate Shemirani, who we just spoke about, in some ways falls into this category. It doesn't always have to be money, I don't think. Like, it's like sometimes it is money, and they're able to make money on social media and to make money from their followers. Richard D. Hall, who I mentioned, from the Disaster Trolls investigation I did, he was someone who also, you know, was selling his book, able to profit from this stuff. But often it's also, I think, about the power and the attention and the following and the community that comes from it too. I think maybe the best example to bring it sort of full circle back to what we were talking about in the beginning is when I found myself sitting for, I think what was possibly 5 hours, it may have been 4, opposite the conspiracy theory newspaper editor, so the editor of The Light, a man called Darren. And he agreed to do an interview with me on the basis that he could ask me questions, which I was perfectly happy to do. And I said, great. And so we turned up in this pub in Leek, and we were sort of sitting in the sort of room upstairs, like where you'd have a birthday party or something. And it was like some kind of, I don't know, it felt like a sort of like boxing match. Like everyone was setting up their stuff. We had our stuff, they had their stuff. He had like this massive, massive pile of, I don't quite know what it was, his notes. And then he had like these laptops, and then he was very annoyed because he was trying to open a video on his laptop and he couldn't connect. And I said, do you want me to help? He said, absolutely not. And I just had my sort of questions, and I was sitting there, and we kind of sat around this table, and the producers that I was working with were kind of on this side, and he had his team who were there. And we'd agreed this setup of, he said, it has to be, I ask a question, you ask a question. I said, okay, that's fine, but I'll just note down what I want to ask you as a follow-up, if that's all right. He said, yeah, that's fine. His questions were so long. Like, his questions were like, and da-da-da-da-da, and I think this about this, I think this about this. And then we'd get 5-10 minutes into the question. I said, what's the question? He was like, oh, well, what do you think? And I was like, oh, that's not really a question. No. And then when I'd ask a question, it would take about 2 minutes. And then he'd go, right, it's my turn again. I'd be like, oh, here we go again. Anyway, it was this back and forth constantly. And it was really interesting. Like, a lot of it was me trying to understand how the paper worked, how it was distributed, how they were funded by advertisers and people donating and stuff like that. So a kind of fact-finding mission. A lot of it, though, was accountability. Like, why are you promoting these kinds of people? Why are you promoting this person who has, for example, spoken about how much they love Adolf Hitler? Why have you, promoted this person who has shared incredibly anti-Semitic views? Why have you shared this stuff that's just obviously not true, or completely without evidence, and so on and so forth? And what became really confusing, maybe, or made it feel really topsy-turvy, was every time I'd answer things, so he'd say things like, well, Marianna, how would you describe what you do? And I'd say, oh, well, I investigate the real world consequences of what's unfolding on social media. And he'd be like, well, yeah, me too. I don't quite think we do the same job. And he was like, no, but we do, you see. We're just on either side of this sort of looking glass. I was like, oh, okay. And it was about halfway through the conversation where I said this thing to him, which is an anecdote, which I apologize if anyone's ever come to any talk I've ever given ever. I always use this anecdote, but I think it's helpful. Is that we're sitting there and I said, look, Darren, this conversation is really hard because we can sit around this table and I might like the table, you might hate the table, but we have to kind of both agree the table is there to talk about the table. If you don't think the table is there, we can't talk about the table because you don't think it's there. And this was the whole problem. It's like he genuinely didn't work. He wasn't working off this shared concept of reality that we all kind of rely on in order to exist in society. And so it was a really complicated conversation. And, you know, I challenged him and he challenged me. And then we found ourselves, you know, the conversation finished and I said, you know, has it changed what you thought about me? And he said, oh, yeah, actually, you're all right. You're quite nice. I said, oh, thanks, that's nice. And he was like, what do you think about me? And I was like, oh, yeah, it's really interesting to talk to you. And then we packed up. And then when we left, again, this is the kind of boxing match feel. So we leave this conversation. And, you know, it was clear to me, having chatted to him, that the thing he got out of this was, to some degree, yes, they were like making a little bit of money, but actually it was about like the community he'd built. It was about the people who were a part of that. It was about the power that it gave him. He got to be a newspaper editor. That was for him much more exciting than some of the other things he was doing. So he clearly clearly offered him a kind of fulfillment. And he loved being the important guy. Like he loved being the sort of like head honcho and the person that they were all sort of hanging off every word of. Or at least that was my impression. But then we left, and he then posted this picture of me. He took this sort of picture on a camcorder, which was a bit strange at the beginning. He sort of went like, will you stand for a photo, and then opened up his camcorder, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah. Anyway, it was the photo he then subsequently used in the paper of me. But he posted it on Facebook straight after we chatted. Bear in mind, it had ended in quite a positive way. It was like, thank you for your time. Actually, I enjoyed that conversation. It was interesting. Thanks for taking my challenges, whatever, we go. And it was this sort of haiku. I don't think it was quite a haiku, but it kind of was like a haiku. And it was like, Marianna shills for cash and she's evil and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And I was thinking, but that's just not how we left it. But that doesn't matter because that's what plays with your fans and that's what you want me to be. And that's what I kind of have to be. And so much of the kind of trolling and online abuse experience is not actually about me. In fact, it's people who basically don't know anything about me. It's people who kind of have an idea of what they sort of want me to be in their perception of reality. And so they decide to kind of take aim at you in that way. And I think Darren, for me, is emblematic of lots and lots of those people who have got something out of this. And it would be a hell of a lot to denounce what they believe now because so much of their identity and even their income derives from that. So they're not going to turn around and say, oh, sorry about that, bit of a funny half hour, and actually I don't believe any of this stuff. They're going to keep going and say, oh, well, no, obviously this is a hoax and this is staged and this is and so on, because otherwise they'd have to kind of give it all up. And Richard D. Hall, it's worth saying, the Disaster Trolls man who I confronted at a market stall in Wales where he was selling these books. When I confronted him, my impression was he was really scared. Like one of the most scared I've ever seen anyone, actually. And I am like, really not very scary. Like I'm 5'1". Like really, I'm not your classic scary person turning up at your market stall. We did have a camp mind, which was a bit scary. But you know, it was then afterwards. So he was quite scared there in the moment. He didn't answer my questions. I said, well, you know, what about the survivors and why do you think this is okay? And this is clearly really harmful to them and it's not true and everything else. And he said, you know, it's all in my book or that's not true. I reject what you're saying. And then he left. And then afterwards he posted this video online, you know, with his suit jacket on and his, here's why the BBC are intimidating me and harassing me for my incredible investigative journalism and all this kinds of stuff. And it was just like this whole other identity. And he's currently going through the courts and imminently we expect to get a ruling on whether he'll have to pay damages or what those damages will be to one of the really brave Manchester Arena survivors, a man called Martin Hibbert, who's taken legal action against him. Martin's in a wheelchair. His daughter Eve was left severely disabled after the attack, and Richard D. Hall has admitted to secretly filming Eve, at the time a young disabled teenager, outside her house to see if she was faking her injuries, which I don't even need to sort of say what I think about that. And you know, he could have, all Martin wanted was for him to say sorry. All Martin wanted was for him to say, oh, I'm really sorry about that. I mean, not really sorry about that. You can't really apologise in that way for that sort of thing. But at least issue some kind of apology where he said, this is wrong, I'm sorry, that's it. But instead, he's doubled down. He's doubled down throughout this court case. And, you know, all probability, looking at other cases like this, the ones that have happened in America, is that he will be asked to pay a huge amount of money. But that it was more important to him to retain his identity and his following, it seems to me at least, than to admit that the things weren't true. And I think that tells you that some of these people, it's not that they, and it's why I call them non-believers with a question mark, it's not that they don't believe this stuff, it's that they come to convince themselves of it because it's useful to them.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what has happened with quite a few of these people. And I should say that both Darren and Richard D. Hall would disagree with absolutely everything I've said and say that they don't say or believe any of those things and that I'm totally wrong. In case they're watching this.
They can watch it afterwards and get back
I
to
know,
you
that's
on
why
it.
I'm saying that.